In the quiet, sweltering heart of Alabama, buried beneath the thick humidity and the long shadows of the pines, lies a question few dared to ask. Can pure evil wear the face of kindness? Can the hands that offer a child shelter also be the same hands that lead them to their grave? For decades, the town of Millbrook believed in the goodness of its most revered institution, a place of hope known simply as the Vance Home for Foundlings. But the home's walls, and the ground beneath it, held a secret far more sinister than anyone could have ever imagined. This is the grim story of the woman they called an angel, a woman who promised warmth and a future but delivered only cold earth and oblivion. This is the story of Matron Eleanor Vance and the 34 children who vanished without a trace, their silent voices forever entombed beneath a house built on lies. The year was 1912. The American South, still reeling from the lingering scars of the Civil War, was a land of stark contrasts. Grand fortunes had been built on cotton and commerce, but for the vast majority, life was a daily struggle against grinding poverty. For orphans, the outlook was bleak. Their lives were often defined by hard labor, malnourishment, and a profound lack of care. In this harsh landscape, a charitable home wasn't just a place of shelter. It was a sanctuary, a lifeline in a world that had forgotten them. This is what made the Vance home so remarkable. Nestled on the outskirts of Millbrook, a small, unassuming building with a welcoming white picket fence, it seemed like a true haven. Local newspapers sang its praises, and the town's most prominent citizens lauded its founder, Matron Eleanor Vance. A widow with a warm smile and a reputation for endless compassion, she was, by all accounts, a saint. She had no children of her own, and so she had dedicated her life to caring for the unwanted. Eleanor's love for the children was a common topic of conversation. Locals would speak of her tireless devotion, her gentle songs sung in the evening, and the fact that she never turned away a child, no matter how dire their condition. Her eyes, they would say, held a deep, bottomless well of sorrow and understanding. Her hands, gnarled from years of work, were always soft when they held a small hand. She was the very picture of maternal grace, a figure of strength and solace in a time of great need. To the community, the Vance home was a place of miracles. Children arrived as listless, hungry shells of their former selves and, within a few weeks, blossomed under Eleanor's care. Their clothes were always mended, their faces scrubbed clean. They were taught to read and write, and they were told they had a chance at a new life. And indeed, many of them did. The children who graduated from her care were often placed in loving homes, adopted by wealthy families from far-off cities. They were the lucky ones. They were the ones who escaped. No one questioned the matron's methods. Her success was their success. It was a point of pride for the town that they had such a selfless figure in their midst. In a world where so many children disappeared into the abyss of poverty, Eleanor Vance was seen as a godsend. She was the living embodiment of charity, proof that goodness still existed in the world. But goodness, it seems, has a price, and Eleanor Vance was always meticulous about collecting hers. The orphanage was a perfectly curated facade, a performance a master puppeteer would envy. But for the curious eye, there were cracks in the porcelain. The children were well fed, yes, but they were also eerily quiet. Their playtime was often spent in silence, a fact brushed off as a sign of their solemn and respectful nature. And then there was the smell, a heavy, earthy scent that clung to the air and was always attributed to the damp Alabama soil after a rain. But it was there even on the driest of days, a scent that hinted at something deeper, something ancient and rotting. Perhaps the most unsettling detail was the constant turnover. While some children found new homes, a disproportionate number simply vanished. When asked, Eleanor would speak of illnesses, of weak constitutions, of children who had returned to God's embrace. In a time when infant mortality was high and disease was a common specter, her explanations were accepted without question. The deaths were tragic, but they were also, sadly, normal. Or so everyone believed. What the town didn't know was that with every tragic death, Eleanor Vance's grim balance sheet was settled. The state and various charitable organizations paid a small stipend for each child under her care, with a final, larger sum issued upon their successful placement, or, in the case of their passing, for burial expenses. And in a house built on kindness, death became a business. It was in this deceptive atmosphere that a young boy named Thomas lived next door. He was a quiet child, often playing alone in his backyard, his only company the sounds that carried over the fence from the Vance home. He saw the matron as the rest of the town did, a kind old woman with a gentle face. But Thomas was different. He was curious. And one sweltering summer afternoon, his simple curiosity would lead him to a discovery that would rip the veil off of Millbrook's most cherished illusion and reveal a horror of unimaginable scale. Thomas was an ordinary boy, but he had an extraordinary vantage point. His family's modest home was separated from the Vance home for foundlings by little more than a thin row of weary oaks and a well-kept garden. From his bedroom window, he could watch the matron and her charges go about their days, a silent observer of a world that, to the town, was a model of grace and compassion. He saw the matron as everyone else did, a woman who seemed to carry the weight of the world's sorrow with a quiet dignity. But Thomas was a child of endless curiosity, a trait adults often dismissed as youthful prying. His curiosity led him to notice the small things, the fissures in the perfect facade. He noticed, for instance, that while the children were always dressed in clean, starched clothes, their shoes were perpetually caked with mud, even on the driest of days. He noticed that their songs, so praised by visitors for their angelic harmony, never seemed to change. The same two hymns were sung, day in and day out, their voices sounding less like a joyous chorus and more like a melancholy, repetitive drone. And there was the way the children would stop playing instantly whenever the matron's shadow fell over them. Their movements would cease, their gazes would fall to the ground, and a profound, unnatural silence would descend upon the yard. It was a silence that spoke not of respect, but of fear. Eleanor Vance, the town saint, was a woman of meticulous habits. Every day at dusk, she would walk the perimeter of her property, her hands clasped behind her back. To the neighbors, it was a quiet, pensive ritual of a weary woman finding solace. But Thomas saw it differently. He saw a woman who scanned the landscape with the sharp, assessing eyes of a predator. She never looked at the stars or the setting sun. Her gaze was always on the ground, a constant, searching survey of her domain. On one occasion, a stray dog, a scruffy mutt that had become Thomas's quiet friend, wandered into the Vance yard. Thomas watched, his breath caught in his throat, as the matron approached the animal. There was no gentle shooing or kind word. Her face, usually a mask of serene compassion, contorted into a cold, hateful scowl. With a swift kick, she sent the whimpering dog scrambling back through the fence, her expression returning to its usual placid state the moment she knew she was observed. Thomas's family, like many in Millbrook, had fallen on hard times. His father had been laid off from the lumber mill, and the weight of their struggles settled in the very air of their home. The post-war economic depression was a suffocating force, a slow tightening of the belt that left little room for questions about a neighbor's business. People were too concerned with keeping their own lights on and their own children fed to think of digging into the affairs of a woman who seemed to be doing such good. And so, the small oddities of the Vance home were either overlooked or rationalized away. The smell, simply the dampness of the land. The quiet children, a testament to their proper upbringing. The swift departure of a child, a merciful relief for a frail body. No one wanted to see the truth, because the lie was so much more comforting. It was this comforting lie that Thomas was now questioning, piece by unsettling piece. He noticed the garden shed. It was a small, unassuming structure at the back of the property, barely visible from the street. The matron, so devoted to her children's every need, was the only one who ever entered it. She would go in with a shovel, and sometimes with a small, wrapped bundle. She never stayed long, but she always emerged with a fresh layer of Alabama red clay on her shoes. Thomas's young mind couldn't make sense of it. Why would a kind woman need a shovel so often? And what were the bundles she carried? He didn't have to wait long for the first part of the answer. One afternoon, while playing a game of catch with his father, their ball sailed over the fence and landed with a soft thud near the shed. His father, tired and distracted, simply told him to go get it. Thomas's heart pounded in his chest, a mix of fear and a powerful, inexplicable pull. He climbed over the fence, his feet sinking into the strangely soft, disturbed earth. The air, he noticed, was thick with the strange, earthy scent that was so prevalent at the Vance home. But here, it was stronger, more cloying. As he picked up the ball, he glanced at the shed door. It was slightly ajar. Through the crack, He could see a small, tattered blanket, the same one that had been draped over the smallest of the foundlings who had arrived only a month earlier. A child who, according to Matron Vance, had been called home to God. Thomas's fingers brushed against the door. The wood splintered and damp. He hesitated, a child on the brink of a terrible discovery. He could run home, his mind racing, his imagination conjuring shadows from every corner of the yard. Or he could take one step forward, one tiny, fateful step that would lead him not to a game of catch, but to a reality far darker than he could ever comprehend. His hand closed around the doorknob, and with a soft, ominous creak, he began to push. The shed door creaked open with the protesting groan of rusted hinges, a sound that in Thomas's ears was louder than a gunshot. The musty air that billowed out was heavy with that same earthy, cloying scent, but here it was tinged with a new, metallic note he couldn't quite place. His heart hammered against his ribs as he peered into the gloom. He didn't find what his frightened imagination had conjured. There were no bodies, no obvious signs of a burial ground. Instead, the small space was a testament to the matron's chillingly organized habits. On the floor, neatly lined against the wall, were shovels and picks of varying sizes. But one stood out. It was a spade with a short handle and a narrow, pointed blade, a tool clearly designed not for a field, but for a confined space. Hung above them were bundles of coarse twine, neatly coiled, and a collection of iron weights and old cloth sacks. It was a bizarre arsenal of tools for a benevolent caregiver, but it was what was on a dusty workbench that truly stole the breath from Thomas's lungs. Pinned to the wall, as if a trophy collection, were small items. A wooden toy soldier with a chipped helmet, a well-worn leather shoe no bigger than a man's hand, a ribbon the color of faded sky, and a smooth, polished stone. These weren't tools of a garden. They were the small, precious possessions of children he had seen playing just weeks before. A quiet, terrifying tally of the lost. He recognized the toy soldier. It had belonged to a little boy named William, who had arrived listless and frail and was said to have died peacefully in his sleep. The cold realization, too large for his young mind to fully grasp, settled over him. These children hadn't been called home to God. They had been buried, and the shed held the proof, not of their lives, but of their grim ends. A faint scratching sound from within the walls made him jump, and he scrambled back, his foot kicking a small, empty tin can. The sudden noise was all it took to break the trance. He darted from the shed, clambered back over the fence, and ran, not to tell his parents, but to his room. Where he sat trembling, the image of those tiny treasures burned into his mind. While young Thomas was coming to grips with a reality no child should ever know, Eleanor Vance was carrying on her public life with a practiced grace. She was a master of her craft, and her craft was deception. To the town doctor, she was a diligent caregiver who, despite her best efforts, was consistently unlucky with the weakest of her charges. She would lament the frailty of life and the cruelty of diseases. When the town council came to inspect her ledgers, she was a model of fiscal responsibility. Her books meticulously detailed with expenses for food, clothing, and the solemn burial costs of those who had passed. No one thought to question the efficiency with which she managed her misfortunes. Eleanor was a chameleon, changing her face to suit her audience. To the wealthy patrons who donated to her cause, she was a beacon of selflessness, a woman who had given up a life of ease to serve the Almighty. She would speak in a soft, demure voice, her eyes welling with manufactured tears as she described the hardships of her work. But in the privacy of her own home, when she thought no one was watching, her movements were sharp, her face hard, devoid of any pretense of warmth. This was the woman Thomas had glimpsed in a fleeting moment, a woman whose public persona was a lie so intricate and so deeply ingrained that it fooled everyone around her. What the town didn't understand was that Eleanor Vance saw the children not as lives to be saved, but as resources to be exploited. Each child was a small pension, a potential death benefit. The truly sick children were the most valuable to her, for their demise was both predictable and profitable. She wasn't just a matron. She was a predator, a scavenger who thrived on the margins of society in the silent suffering of the forgotten. Now, with Thomas having stumbled upon her secret, a new element entered her grim calculation: risk. That evening, as Thomas lay in his bed, his mind replaying the image of the toy soldier and the small shoe. He heard it. The quiet rustle of leaves outside his window. He held his breath, his eyes wide in the darkness. A shadow passed by, and for a split second, a face was illuminated by the moonlight. The matron, her eyes fixed on his window, her expression not of kindness or sorrow, but of cold, terrifying calculation. The hunter had just become aware of her prey. The boy who had counted bodies in his mind was now a body to be counted. Part 4 of 6. The shadow at the window was gone as quickly as it had appeared, but Thomas was left with a cold, creeping certainty. The kind matron, the town's angel, was aware of him. He had become a flaw in her carefully constructed world, a potential witness, a loose thread she would undoubtedly seek to cut. He spent the night in a state of terrified vigilance. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of the wind, sounded like a footstep approaching his door. The next morning, the world seemed to carry on as if nothing had changed. The sun was just as warm, the birds just as loud, and the Vance home for foundlings looked just as perfect as it always had. But to Thomas, the white picket fence no longer symbolized safety. It felt like a cage. He tried to tell his parents, but the words felt too large for his mouth, too monstrous for their ears. How could he explain the toy soldier and the little shoe without sounding like a child lost in a macabre game? His father, burdened by debt and the relentless Alabama heat, simply patted his head and told him not to worry. Adults, he realized, were often too preoccupied with the troubles they could see to believe in the terrors that lay just beneath the surface. While Thomas wrestled with his newfound knowledge, the matron was already at work. Her movements were more deliberate now, her smile a little too wide, her gaze lingering on Thomas's home for a moment longer than was natural. To the town, she was preparing for the annual church social, her hands busy with baking and mending. But in the quiet moments, Thomas watched as she went to her shed, a small, knowing glint in her eyes. He saw her return with a sack that bulged ominously, and a sense of absolute dread washed over him. He felt an intense, burning need to warn someone, to scream what he knew from the rooftops, but the words caught in his throat. What drives a person to such a terrifying end? Was Matron Vance a monster from the beginning, born without a soul? Or was she a product of her time, twisted by a desperation that corroded her humanity? We can only speculate. Perhaps she saw the children as a form of currency, a way to survive the crushing poverty that had taken so many. Her own life, we can imagine, was likely filled with loss and hardship. Did she justify her actions by believing she was simply doing what was necessary in a brutal world? Did she convince herself that her victims were better off, free from a life of certain suffering? Her meticulous record-keeping, her careful collection of burial stipends, it all points to a chillingly rational mind. She was not a beast driven by blind rage. She was an accountant of death, a cold and efficient collector of souls. The silence that had once defined the Vance home now felt like a living thing, a coiled serpent ready to strike. It was in this suffocating atmosphere that a new child arrived. His name was Peter. He was a small, pale boy, no older than 4, with large, frightened eyes and a persistent cough. Thomas saw him from his window, clinging to the matron's skirt, his small body trembling. Thomas's stomach turned. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that Peter was to be the next to disappear. The new child was a ticking clock. Thomas knew he had to act, but he couldn't do it alone. He needed undeniable proof. He needed to get inside the Vance home. He waited for a Sunday, when the matron would be at church, her meticulous routine a brief window of opportunity. With a heart pounding in his ears, he crept through the yard. The same soft, disturbed earth he had felt before now seemed to sigh under his weight. The back door was old, its lock rusty and fragile. A single, decisive push, and it gave way with a faint, metallic click. The inside of the Vance home was a shock. From the outside, it had seemed so perfect, so warm. But inside, it was a tomb. The air was cold, stale, and smelled of mothballs and decay. The furniture was covered in dust sheets, and the children's rooms were Spartan and empty, as if no one lived there at all. But in the matron's study, a small room overflowing with dusty ledgers and papers, Thomas found what he was looking for. A small, black book, its cover worn from years of use. He opened it, his hands shaking, and saw page after page filled with small, spidery writing. Not names, but numbers. A list of expenses, burial sites, and, scrawled on a single page, a simple, chilling epitaph for each of the lost children. A name, a date, and a final, horrifying word. A map. It wasn't a map of the property. It was a diagram of the floorboards in the very cellar he was standing above. Each square was marked with a date and a name. He had been looking for a burial ground outside, but the truth was closer, and far more gruesome than he could have ever imagined. The Vance home wasn't a sanctuary. It was a mass grave. The world outside fell away, replaced by the suffocating cold of the cellar and the frantic pounding of Thomas's own heart. The floor was rough, unpolished wood, but beneath it, he now knew, lay the truth. His trembling fingers traced the diagram in the black book, finding the exact spot marked with a cross and the name, Peter. He got down on his knees and tapped the board. It gave a hollow, empty sound that resonated through the silence like a death knell. With a desperate resolve, he found a loose floorboard. It was surprisingly easy to pry up. As he lifted it, a heavy, stagnant air rushed up to greet him, carrying with it that familiar, earthy scent. But now so much more potent. It was the smell of damp soil and something else, something sweet and sickly. The matron hadn't just buried her victims in the garden. She had buried them beneath the very home where she claimed to care for them. He shone the small beam of his father's lantern into the darkness. It was a space so small, no more than 3 feet deep, filled with mounds of freshly turned earth. He saw it then. Tucked into one of the mounds was a small, tattered patch of blue cloth, the same color as the little boy Peter's shirt. Thomas's breath hitched. He closed his eyes, squeezing them shut, but the image was already burned into his mind. It was a vision of innocence buried in darkness, a cruel end to a life that had only just begun. The horror wasn't in what he was seeing, but in what it represented. Each mound of dirt wasn't just a grave. It was a murdered child, a silent, unseen victim of an unfathomable evil. He pulled another board loose, and then another. The light danced across the cold, damp soil, revealing the chilling truth. Here was a small, white button. There, a scrap of ribbon. And then, at the base of a support beam, something that was undeniably, horrifyingly human. A tiny, skeletal hand, its fingers curled inward as if still grasping for a life that had been stolen. It was a glimpse into a world of pure, unadulterated evil. It was the face of the monster, and it wasn't some creature of legend. It was a woman who was held up as a saint. The full weight of the discovery came crashing down on him. It wasn't just a few children. The diagram in the book was a map of a massacre. He looked at the floorboards above him, suddenly realizing he was standing on a floor of death, each footstep a step on a grave. He knew he had to get out. He had to scream. He had to tell someone what he had found. The fear that had been a tremor in his gut now became a tidal wave of panic. He dropped the lantern, and in the sudden, lurching darkness, he heard it. The faint, unmistakable sound of the front door closing. It was too early. The church social wasn't over. Eleanor Vance was back. He heard her footsteps from the floor above, slow and deliberate. Each creak was a hammer blow to his sanity. She was moving through the house, her steps methodical, as if she were checking on her possessions. The floorboards above him groaned under her weight. He scrambled back into a shadowy corner, clutching the small, damning book to his chest. He held his breath, the air thick with the smell of death, and listened as her footsteps came closer. He could hear her humming a tune, a simple, childlike lullaby, the same one she sang to the children at night. The footsteps stopped directly above him. A profound, terrifying silence filled the space, broken only by the frantic pounding of his own heart. He knew she was listening. He could feel her presence through the floorboards, a tangible weight of malice. Then, the floorboards above him creaked once more, and he heard the distinct, sickening sound of a single, heavy boot sliding across the wood. A door latch clicked, and a shaft of light cut through the gloom. Matron Eleanor Vance was at the top of the cellar stairs, her face a mask of serene, knowing contentment. In her hand, she held a lantern, and in her eyes, there was no longer sorrow or compassion. There was only the cold, unblinking hunger of a predator who had finally cornered her prey. Eleanor Vance stood at the top of the cellar stairs, a spectral figure framed by the glow of her lantern. Her eyes, Those same eyes that had once been described as wells of compassion were now as empty and cold as a winter sky. Thomas, frozen in the corner, felt a primal terror. The weight of her gaze was more suffocating than the damp cellar air. She took a single, deliberate step down, the silence punctuated by the creak of the wood. The huntress had cornered her prey, but Matron Vance had forgotten one key element, the curiosity of a child. As she descended, Thomas, his mind racing, remembered a small vent near the floor. It was old, rusty, and led to the side of the house. With a burst of desperate energy, he scrambled toward it, a flurry of motion that startled the matron. She lunged, her serene mask breaking into a snarl of rage. But she was a woman of age, and her movements were slow compared to his. He managed to kick the vent grate loose and squeeze through the opening, the rough metal scraping against his skin. He tumbled out into the evening light, gasping for air, the cold, stale scent of the cellar still clinging to him. He ran. He ran faster than he had ever run in his life, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. He didn't stop until he was at the door of the sheriff's office, the black book clutched tightly in his hand. He wasn't a boy crying wolf this time. He was a witness to a horror beyond imagination. The investigation that followed was a grim affair. Sheriff Miller, a man who had known Eleanor Vance his entire life, was a picture of disbelief, his hands shaking as he held the small, black book. The warrant was signed, and they returned to the Vance home, not as visitors, but as invaders. The silence that had once seemed so peaceful now felt deafening, a shroud over a terrible secret. They found her in the parlor, humming her lullaby, her eyes as calm as if nothing was wrong. When the sheriff showed her the book, she smiled, a small, serene smile that held no remorse. The discovery was beyond what anyone could have prepared for. The floorboards of the cellar were pried up, one by one, revealing the shallow, hastily dug graves. The first one contained the remains of little Peter. The next, a girl with a missing braid. The next, a boy with a half-eaten wooden soldier still clutched in his tiny, skeletal fingers. As they dug, the horrifying truth revealed itself. One body, then 5, then a dozen. They found the remains of 34 children, all buried beneath the very house where they were promised a second chance at life. The Vance home was no sanctuary. It was a mass grave. The town of Millbrook was plunged into a collective state of shock and grief. The woman they had praised, the woman they had seen as a saint, was a monster. Every donation they had made, every kind word they had spoken, now felt like a complicit act in the murder of 34 innocents. A palpable sense of shame and betrayal settled over the community. They had been so willing to believe the beautiful lie that they had ignored the small, unsettling truths. The quiet children, the strange, earthy smell, the constant turnover. They had all chosen to look away, and their ignorance had cost lives. Eleanor Vance was taken away without a fight. She offered no confessions, showed no emotion. She was judged by the horrified people of the town long before any court could convene. Her final fate is lost to the sands of time. Some say she was confined to an asylum, others that she was taken to a prison, and simply vanished from the historical record. But her legacy remains a chilling testament to the darkness that can hide in the light. The Vance home for foundlings was torn down, every splinter of wood, every brick, and every foot of soil removed to be purified. A single, simple monument was erected in its place, with 34 small, white crosses to mark the silent graves of the forgotten. Thomas, the boy who discovered the truth, went on to live a quiet life, haunted by the memory of the shed and the small, wooden toy. The case of the Orphanage of Skulls is not just a tale of a monstrous woman. It is a terrifying cautionary tale about the insidious nature of evil and the dangers of blind faith. It reminds us that sometimes the most horrific secrets are not buried deep in the forest, but right beneath our feet, in the most ordinary of places, and that the most dangerous kind of evil is that which wears a human face, a kind smile, and a promise of salvation.